That is the sound of the fourth day upon the Anfoglith, a heavy, suffocating silence that hangs over the gasping dust, broken only by the snap of banners in a dry, sulphurous wind. Thousands of elven eyes, sharp as the spears they hold, stare northward at the peaks of Thangorodrim. They are waiting for a signal that will not come, waiting for the second arm of a pincer that has already been delayed by shadows and lies. In the trenches of the west, High King Fingon holds his host in check. The discipline is absolute, yet brittle as glass. Morgoth, the great strategist of fear, understands this fragility better than the Eldar understand themselves. He does not send a legion to break the line. He sends a single prisoner, Was. Gelmer of Nargothrond, blinded, broken. He is dragged before the outworks of Barad Eithel, a gruesome piece of theater intended to provoke. And it works. When the orcs hew his limbs from his body, the strategic patience of the Noldor evaporates in a flash of red grief. There is no hornblast from the king. There is only the rider Gwyndor, driven mad by the butchery of his brother, breaking ranks. One rider becomes 10. 10 becomes a torrent. The entire western host surges forward, abandoning the defensive walls, abandoning the plan, pouring onto the plains like liquid fire. The trap is sprung not by iron, but by sorrow. This is how the unnumbered tears begin. To understand the scale of the catastrophe that followed Gwyndor's charge, you must first look at the map. The assault was never meant to be a singular wave of fury. It was designed as a masterpiece of synchronization, a grand strategic architecture known as the Union of Maedhros. For nearly 500 years, the Noldor had relied on the Siege of Angband, a static containment line. But the Battle of Sudden Flame had shattered that doctrine. Maedhros, the eldest son of Pelennor, and the architect of this new alliance, understood a grim truth. Containment was dead. Morgoth could not be starved out. He had to be dug out. The operational plan was a classic pincer movement on a continental scale. The strategy relied on two massive hosts acting as closing jaws. In the west, stationed in the fortress of Barad Eithel and the misty shadows of Hithlum, lay the High King Fingon. His force was a coalition of the Orthodox, the heavy infantry of the Noldor, the grim-faced men of Dor-lomin under Húrin and Thalion, and a small reluctant contingent of elves from Nargothrond. They were the Anvil. In the east, Maedhros commanded the hammer. His host gathered upon the hill of Himring, a more volatile mixture of disparate powers. Here marched the remaining sons of Pelennor, the heavy shock troops of the Easterlings. Tribes of men recently arrived who swore allegiance to the elven lords, and, crucial to the logistical chain, the dwarves of Belagost. The dwarves were not merely infantry. They were the armored division of the First Age, bringing fire-hardened masks and heavy axes capable of withstanding heat that would liquefy elven mail. The plan dictated that Maedhros would march first. He was to draw the bulk of Morgoth's armies out onto the Anfoglith, the gasping dust. This vast, ash-choked plain was a logistical nightmare for a living army, offering no forage, no water, and no cover. However, it offered a killing floor. Once Morgoth's forces were committed to the east, engaging Maedhros, Fingon would sweep down from the west. Caught between the hammer and the anvil, the hosts of Angband would be crushed and the gates of hell smashed open. It was a sound plan. Militarily, it was brilliant, but it relied on a single fragile variable: timing. In warfare, the most dangerous enemy is often not the opposing general, but the friction of logistics and intelligence. Morgoth did not need to defeat the strategy. He only needed it to disrupt the clock. He had infested the eastern host with spies long before the first spear was polished. The Easterling clans were divided. While Bor the Faithful held true, the clan of Ulfang the Black was already bought and paid for. So, when the appointed day dawned, the western host looked east and saw nothing but dust. Maedhros was delayed, not by weather, not by incompetence, but by the subtle sabotage of false reports and feigned delays within his own ranks. The synchronized pincer was disjointed. This is why Gwyndor's premature charge in the west was so fatal. It happened in isolation. When the western host poured onto the plain, they were not closing a trap. They were walking into one. They extended their supply lines deep into the desolation without the eastern support to cover their flank. The terrain of the Unfoglaith served as an accelerant to the disaster. It is flat, hard-packed ash, ideal for the movement of massive infantry blocks, but deadly for a retreating force. There are no rivers to put behind you, no forests to hide in, just leagues of gray dust. Morgoth's counterforce was not a mindless horde. He deployed his troops in echelons. He held back his strategic reserves, the Balrogs and the Father Dragons, waiting for the alliance to overextend. He allowed Fingon's rage to pull the Western army all the way to the very walls of Angband. He let them think they were winning. He let them exhaust their stamina sprinting across the desert. And only then, when the elves were beating upon his doors, winded and unsupported, did he open the gates. He did not send the main army to meet them immediately. He sent decoys to bait them. And then, hidden in the smog and the slag heaps of Thangorodrim, he maneuvered his true strength to surround them. The Union of Maedhros failed not on the battlefield, but in the briefing room. It failed because it assumed that every heart that beat against Morgoth beat with the same loyalty. It failed to account for the rot from within. The grand numbers, tens of thousands of spears. The unity of elves, men, and dwarves were rendered meaningless because the two arms of the pincer were out of time. And in the face of a power like Morgoth, being late is the same as being dead. The retreat from the gates of Angband was not initially a rout. It was a fighting withdrawal, a desperate attempt to trade space for time. The western host, winded and bloody, was pushed back across the ash by a tide of orcs that seemed to spawn from the very ground. For hours, the Noldor discipline held. They formed shield walls, stepped back, killed, and stepped back again. But geometry was against them. They were encircled, a shrinking island of silver mail in a sea of black iron. Then, a sound cut through the din of battle, not a scream of war, but a trumpet blast. From the south, unlooked for and unknown to Morgoth's spies, came Turgon, king of Gondolin. The hidden city had emptied its strength. 10,000 spears, gleaming white, smashed into the orc flank. It was a tactical masterstroke. The encirclement was broken. Turgon hewed his way to his brother Fingon. And for a fleeting moment, amidst the mire of blood, the High King and the Lord of Gondolin clasped hands. The gloom of the Thangorodrim seemed to lift. This was the false dawn. At that precise moment, the horizon to the east finally shimmered with dust. Maedhros had arrived. The hammer was late, but it swung with terrible force. The sons of Pelennor and the Easterling clans struck the enemy's rear. The orcs wavered. The pincers were finally closing. Even Morgoth, deep within his dark throne room, felt a tremor of doubt. He emptied his fortress. The last reserves were thrown in. Wolves, Balrogs, dragons, and every soldier capable of bearing a weapon. The battle hung in a terrifying equilibrium. The victory of the Eldar was mathematically possible. The lines of Angband were bending. But Morgoth did not rely on the strength of his soldiers. He relied on the weakness of men. On the eastern wing, the banner of Maedhros advanced. But in the midst of the charge, the clan of Ulfang the Black halted. It was a maneuver that confused the elven commanders, a sudden gap opening in the line. Then, the confusion turned to horror. The Easterlings did not just stop. They turned their spears. It is difficult to overstate the military devastation of this moment. In the heat of a melee, a soldier trusts the man to his right more than he trusts his own armor. When that trust is severed, an army ceases to be an organism and becomes a mob. Ulfang's sons struck the sons of Pelennor from the rear. Fresh contingents of wicked men hidden in the hills swarmed down to join the traitors. The eastern host didn't just break, it dissolved into a fratricidal brawl. Maedhros, Maglor and the remaining brothers were forced to cut their way out, not through orcs, but through the men they had armed and fed. The hammer was shattered. The western host was now alone. The pincer was gone. The full weight of Angband pivoted west. Glaurung, the father of dragons, slithered onto the field. He was not yet winged, but he was a massive armored siege engine of flesh and fire. He drove a wedge between the hosts of Maedhros and Fingon, ensuring they could never rejoin. The elves fled before his heat, their armor searing their skin. Only the dwarves of Belegost stood firm. This is a critical tactical detail, often overlooked: the metallurgical superiority of the dwarves. Their heavy iron masks withstood the dragon fire that melted elven helms. Under the Lord Azekal, the dwarves formed a phalanx around the beast, hacking at his belly with great axes. Azekal, crushed beneath the dragon's bulk, drove a knife into the creature's underbelly with his last breath. The wound was grievous enough to force Glaurung to withdraw, dragging his brood with him. This rear-guard action by the dwarves saved the sons of Feanor from total annihilation. But the battle for the north was already lost. Now, Morgoth turned his eyes to the kill. He sought the head of the High King. Fingon was isolated. His personal guard lay dead in heaps around his standard. Gothmog, Lord of Balrogs, advanced. This was not a duel of chivalry, it was an execution. Fingon fought with the desperate grace of the Noldor, his sword ringing against the Balrog's whip. But Gothmog was not alone. Another Balrog approached from behind, casting a thong of fire around Fingon, binding his arms. The king of the Noldor was helpless. Gothmog's black axe fell. The royal standard was trodden into the blood-soaked ash. The command structure of the West was decapitated. Panic threatened. Total rout, the kind where an entire people is wiped out, was imminent. But in the midst of the collapse, the discipline of the Edain, the men of Dorlomin, held the line. Húrin and Húr, the lords of the House of Hador, understood the strategic reality. The High King was dead. The battle was lost. The only remaining objective was the preservation of Turgon, the heir to the kingship. If Gondolin fell here, the Noldor were finished. They urged Turgon to flee. Go now, Lord, while there is time, Húr spoke with the foresight of death upon him. For from you and from me, a new star shall rise. Turgon gathered the wreckage of his army and retreated south toward the pass of Sirion. To buy him time, the men of Dorlomin formed a living wall across the fen of Serek. This was the ultimate sacrifice. They were not fighting to survive, they were fighting to die, slowly. The fen of Serech was a choke point, a narrow causeway between marshes. The men of Hador clogged it with their bodies. They were not driven back. They did not break. They simply ceased to exist, one by one. Húr fell, pierced by a venomous arrow, and all his men were slain around him. Last of all stood Húrin. He threw aside his shield. He wielded a two-handed axe with a berserker's fury. The prose of history records that he slew 70 trolls of Gothmog's guard. But do not picture this as a glorious superheroic stand. Picture a man covered in the black blood of his enemies and the red blood of his brother, screaming defiance at a god. Each time he swung his axe, he cried out, "Ore en Tuluva, day shall come again." It was a statement of philosophical defiance against the long defeat. He was not saying, "We will win today." He was saying, "You cannot extinguish the light forever." But eventually, the sheer mass of enemies overwhelmed him. The orcs were commanded to take him alive. They grappled him by the sheer weight of numbers, burying him under a mound of severed limbs and bodies until he could no longer lift his arms. The sun set on the Nirnaeth Arnoediad. The plain was silent again, save for the groans of the dying. The trap had worked. The treachery had struck. The kings were dead or scattered. The union was broken. And Húrin Thalion, the mightiest warrior of mortal men, was dragged in chains to Thangorodrim, to witness the ruin he had fought to prevent. Victory for Morgoth was absolute, but it was not clean. The carnage was so vast that it presented a logistical problem even for the victors. By the order of the Dark Lord, the orcs did not leave the bodies to rot where they fell. They gathered the slain, elves and men alike, and piled them into a great mound in the midst of the desert. They called it Húrin, the Hill of Slain. It stands as the grim monument to the battle's physical cost, but it also serves as a strange testament to the limits of Morgoth's corruption. For it is said that the grass grew long and green upon that hill alone, in all the ash of the Anfoglyth. No servant of Angband dared to tread upon it. The earth itself, though conquered, refused to forget. The geopolitical consequences, however, were immediate and total. The Siege of Angband wasn't just broken, the board was flipped. The realm of Fingon was no more. Hithlum was occupied not by orcs, but by the Easterlings. Here lies the final irony of the treachery. Morgoth did not reward Ulfang's people with the fertile lands of Beleriand as promised. He locked them in the misty cold lands of the north, denying them the right to leave. He used the traitors as jailers for the remnants of the House of Hador. Treason, it seems, is a currency that buys nothing but a new master. The sons of Pelennor, once the lords of the East, were reduced to a scattered band of forest dwellers, wandering the wild like hunted beasts. Their power was broken. Gondolin remained, hidden and shut tight, the last flicker of the Noldor's hope. But it was a city under a death sentence, waiting for a doom that was now inevitable. But the deepest wound was not on the map. It was in the soul of the Alliance. The Nirnaeth Arnoediad killed the trust between the children of Ilúvatar. From that day forth, the elves, save for those few who knew the Edain well, looked upon the race of men with suspicion and fear. They saw the face of Ulfang in every mortal stranger. The doom of Mandos was vindicated. The Noldor could not build a victory on Middle-earth, for the very tools they used would turn against them. The battle proved a terrifying philosophical truth. Absolute valor is insufficient. Fingon was brave, Húrin was mighty. The plan was sound, and they lost. They lost because they were fighting a war of bodies against a masters of spirits. The unnumbered tears were not shed merely for the dead. They were shed for the death of hope. The Noldor finally understood that the long defeat had truly begun. There would be no second union. There would be no great counterattack. From this moment on, the history of the First Age is a history of a slow, agonizing retreat to the sea. The realization settled cold and heavy in the hearts of the wise. Salvation, if it were ever to come, could not be forged by swords in the north. It would have to come, unlooked for, from the west. But the west was silent, and the north belonged to the dark.